works.
Well, it's saying it's in progress.
Okay.
Okay, let's get going. I guess we have 3 minutes past. So this meeting is really to discuss a POP. So so what I would like to do is kind of first I have one page kind of to show about the documents, because Roman and I don't have a very long history with OAUTH, and some of those documents are really old. So so I want to just present those documents. These are mainly the documents that Hannes shared in the invitation. And let me, where do I share? How do I share here? Share content. Can you guys see my screen? Yeah, I'm hoping you could.
Yes, works.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I just want to talk about those for a minute or two here, and then Brian prepared a few slides that he wants also to present and discuss, and I guess we'll take it from there. So so that's my plan, like just to talk about this in general and dig deeper into it. So these are the documents that we have today about POP. There are, and I've kind of separated them into a few groups: the MAC and POP security architecture, which includes the MAC address, the MAC draft, and the POP architecture and distribution draft. And then we've talked about the HTTP signatures. There are few old drafts and a newer one that is being discussed right now. There is the ACE work with one RFC and OAuth authorization draft. There is obviously the POP JOT that has been on RFC for some time. There is the MTLS work, and the recent one is DPOP. So I guess our goal here in this meeting is to try to understand the overlaps between all of those kind of proposals that we have on the table, and if there are any misalignments between those proposals, to understand why and how we could resolve those. Again, we personally, and Roman and myself, we don't have lots of history with OAuth, so some of those are completely new to us. We haven't looked at them for a long time. For example, those initial ones, the CAVG and the signed HTTP request too. So that's the goal of the meeting. And any comments about this? Does that sounds like a plan here? Okay. Okay. So I don't have slides prepared, so I will, I guess, pass it to Brian to be able to kind of walk us through his slides, what he has to say, and we'll take it from there.
Okay. Should I just try to share directly from here? And
Yes.
okay. I cover some of these drafts a little bit too, so I'll try to talk about them a bit more. Let's see. Does this?
Yeah, we can see it.
Does it show up in kind of slideshow mode here?
Yeah.
Okay. Oops. So yeah, so as is my trademark here, throw a few photos up here, and we've got a interim meeting. This is the second one between the Singapore and Vancouver, but between Singapore and Vancouver. So here you are. We're want to talk about just sort of the general concepts of proof of possession in OAuth 2 and the variety of different tracks of work that are out there and what's currently being worked on or there's interest in, and see if we can come to some at least agreement on where we should be taking the work and what we should be doing going forward. So I'll try to set the stage for some of that. And yeah. So back in Singapore at 106, we had 2 different meetings, and just to try to set some tone for how we got to this interim, there's a recording from the YouTube shows of me in 2 different outfits at 2 different meetings presenting the same slide. So I prepared a presentation on Depop and tried to get through the content twice, and was got to slide 6 before a barrage of questions and comments and criticisms were levied, and we never made it past there. And during that time, I think during the end of the second attempt, Hannah suggested we consider doing a virtual interim to see if we could move the conversation forward a little bit more than we had during that time. So some things that were not presented at that time were, I got through part of the technical explanation of how Depop sort of worked. Hopefully folks on the call are at least familiar with the basics of what the proposal is. And then I had a slide here with some folks sort of praising or expressing interest in the work to try to show that there was interest out there in the work progressing, and people eager to see it progress and consider implementing it. And that whole presentation was meant to wrap up with a beautiful picture of Vancouver and a humble call that the working group consider a call for adoption on the Depop draft. But that didn't go down that way, and maybe it's for the better, but there were a lot of different comments, opinions and concerns expressed around the draft. And I tried to capture the spirit of the meeting here around the outside here with all the various commenters. This was all taken from the YouTube recording of the meeting, actually just one meeting. But we didn't get to a call to adoption. It's still an individual draft, and I think there's some I guess diverse opinions about whether that should become a working group item or as is, or whether there's other pursuits the working group should follow to try to attain some sort of reliable Depop type, or I'm sorry, proof of possession type method in OAuth itself. Yeah, just setting a little bit of tone here. So Hannah suggested the interim, and we did get an interim scheduled, but it ended up being focused around the 2.1 or whatever it may be called effort. And then a later poll around discussing POP or Depop, and then finally the sort of last minute scheduling of this as we approach the actual meeting here in Vancouver, assuming that does happen, but that's a different question. And this list of drafts here, as well as Daniel sort of asking what happened to Depop in the list of topics. Not necessarily because it's the only thing here, but it is sort of the catalyst of discussion right now around how the working group proceeds with the POP question. So some of the motivations, at least in my mind, but I think in general, representing some of the working group motivations for something like Depop or a generalized POP approach, is really there's sort of this broad one that we'd like to do something that's better than bearer tokens, and that's broad. There's a lot of different reasons for wanting that, but I do think that there is at least some consensus for having something in this solution space. Also, we have the OAuth 2 security BCP that is, it was making its way through last call. We might have another one, but it somewhat aspirationally, but it does recommend the use of sender constrained tokens. And there's some work occurring in the FAPI financial grade API working group that does the same, basically recommends or even requires the use of some kind of sender constrained or key constrained tokens. And largely, at least in the BCP, this is around preventing the play or replay at a different endpoint or resource from the one that originally received the tokens, but there's a number of other benefits that are bestowed upon POP tokens as well. Proof of possession bound refresh tokens for public clients that don't themselves have provisioned authentication credentials is also a recommendation of the security BCP, and there's really not a lot we have available to actually realize that recommendation. And sort of furthermore, we're in this position where we have these recommendations, but OAuth really lacks a suitable and widely applicable POP mechanism. The MTLS spec was recently published as an RFC, which is great, and I think it's super useful for a small sort of niche set of deployments, but quoting some sentiment that I think is held reasonably widely, that it is virtually undeployable for general purpose applications. I'll let them rename nameless, but a working group participant said that during the meeting. And short of MTLS, we don't really have a viable solution that's spec'd out and interoperable that we can recommend to the populace at large, at the same time that we have these best practice security documents that are saying you need to do this, which is sort of a problematic situation to be in. It's sort of sending out advice that can't actually be met in the vast majority of cases. And the problems or the lack of solutions for POP type tokens is actually exacerbated when we're talking about single page applications or JavaScript applications running in the browser. If you look at MTLS for OAuth, it would have major usability issues with SPAs when you get into the browser requesting from the end user to select certificates outside of very tightly constrained sort of corporate environments that pre-provision certificates to their browsers. I don't think that this is the sort of thing that the average user is really capable or willing to deal with. It'll cause a lot more problems than it would any solutions. And while many of us, myself included, sort of pinned our hopes on token binding for a while, it's really dead in the water in terms of adoption and implementation in the world. And even if it was moving along, or it wasn't caught in the situation, it needed fetch level API changes to actually work for SPA type applications. And that's an even bigger sort of push to get in there. So it's just not happening. There's a lot here. I'll try to go through these quickly, but reiterate some of the things that Rafat had at the beginning, which is sort of a look at the existing POP efforts that we've had in OAuth throughout the ages, if you will. OAuth 1 started with what was effectively a sort of Mac style signature operation with the client key or client secret or whatever it was called at the time sort of mixed into all that. And at least the folklore, the canon is that that was very difficult and that made interop very problematic. And as sort of a response to that, OAuth 2 itself pushed away from doing that level of sort of signature verification and tried to rely more completely on TLS. But some of the participants at the time, including the author up until the very end, was still interested in having some sort of POP work. So RFC 6749 does have open-ended extension points that would allow for this stuff to happen, even though the sort of the baseline framework and the initial stuff was released only with bearer tokens. The author at that time was working on this Mac style tokens that was, I don't know, somewhat active for a while, but largely just died out due to lack of interest when he resigned from working on it and anything to do with the working group. Our working group here did get proof of possession key semantics for JSON web tokens published, RFC 7800, which sounds really fancy, and is super useful, but it doesn't do a lot in and of itself. It largely just defines the CNF claim, the confirmation claim, which is a way to embed in JOTS the key that you would probably need to confirm somehow to have a proof of possession token, but it's completely silent on the way that you would get that claim into the token in a reliable way, or what means of actually proving possession or confirmation during an actual HTTP exchange or protocol exchange would look like. So it's an important building block, but it sort of doesn't do anything on its own. We had an architecture document discussing sort of ideas and almost requirements around what proof of possession would look like, as well as this authorization server to client key distribution draft, the POP key distribution, which describes, and it's now expired, but describes both how a public key could be presented to the authorization server by the client, or the server could present to the client a symmetric key, or it looks like list of symmetric keys. It's a little bit unclear, but really just about the client and the authorization server telling each other what keys to use for the tokens. And along with that, a sort of companion document at the time was this method for signing HTTP requests for OAuth, which was sort of a JOT-based pick your own parts, semi-canonicalized signing of the HTTP request with the key that presumably was received from the use of POP key distribution. That also is fairly long expired and had the purported benefit of sort of being an a la carte selection of what was signed, which was meant to alleviate the potential problems with signing HTTP in general, which is that intermediaries often change or modify or add to requests as they go through. So the idea being that if the client said just what parts it was going to sign, you could work around some of those things, but also didn't have a minimum amount of what needed to be signed and left a lot up to sort of be negotiated and figured out between the two. And also wasn't able to handle some things like repeating request parameters and some other cases like that. I think we all know that signed HTTP requests are difficult to do for a variety of reasons. Those two were sort of where proof of possession was going for a while. And then along came the shining promise of token binding, which did become a series of RFCs out of the token binding working group and were published as RFCs. And we also had here a OAuth profile of using HTTPS token binding. And I admit to have been very excited and distracted by this, but larger factors came along, and this work, as I described a little bit earlier, is basically dead. Although the RFCs are there, it's really not progressing. There's not adoption or implementation of the underlying technologies, and then the work in this working group on this particular draft stalled out around the same time, and it too is expired and not really progressing anywhere. During the course of some of this stuff, Nat published this JWT POP token usage, which I wouldn't say is really a protocol at all, or anything that would be interoperable, but it is an interesting exploration of a few different ways that POP tokens could sort of manifest themselves, everything from some work that later ended up being part of the MTLS work right below it to a challenge response type of protocol. And there's some ideas in there, but nothing that took hold beyond at least laying the groundwork for some of the ideas that came up in the OAuth 2 mutual TLS client authentication and certificate bound access tokens. So that one itself does a few things, including client authentication and thus binding refresh tokens to that client authentication with mutual TLS, as well as affording the ability to bind refresh tokens to MTLS client authentication for public clients, and of course, generalized sort of proof of possession certificate bound access tokens. It's now RFC, it's been implemented and deployed, it's out there, but it really does have some difficulties in deployment that are just sort of inherent in the nature of how mutual TLS deployments and trust frameworks and various components work. And so it can be used, it does meet a pretty high bar of security and binds these access tokens to private keys and proof of possession at the transport layer. It all works really well if you can get it deployed, but it's just not feasible, I think, for a pretty significant chunk of the deployments out there. And in particular, the SPA type deployments, it's sort of a non-starter. It just doesn't work. And so about a year or so, I've lost track of time. Some of us were talking at the OAuth security workshop and started to revitalize the idea of some sort of application layer mechanism to do proof of possession that might be a little bit simpler and more generally applicable than something like MTLS. And that eventually manifested itself in the form of the Depop work, which we've discussed a few times at the face-to-face meetings and have either just not progressed yet, and haven't gotten past the sort of individual draft stage. During the time leading up to the last meeting, there was a suggestion on list that from Neil Madden, where he suggested what he called a tentative suggestion for an alternative design, either to Depop, change to Depop, or maybe a distinct document from Depop, but that would be based on similar ideas about sort of sending a header, but rather than doing a full asymmetric signature on every single request, which there's been some concern expressed about the efficiency and cost of that. He proposed the idea of looking into doing ECDH type key exchange up front in the series of exchanges, and then using the resulting symmetric key to do an HMAC rather than a public key signature over the sort of little proof token for each individual request, which on when I first heard it, it was leading up to the meeting itself, and I was sort of invested in presenting Depop and sort of liked the idea. So I was a little reluctant to really listen to it, but he did some additional work showing that it is more complicated than Depop, but it's not as significantly more complicated. Probably it's maybe a step more complicated, not an order of magnitude. So, and it maybe is something that can land us in a middle ground of doing an application level proof of possession that is also reasonably performant in terms of the use of cryptography. So I include that here, even though it was just an email, because I'm actually really interested in the concept moving forward. I'd like us to think about it.
So Brian, and just question about that Depop and the alternative approach also, and how does any of this overlap with any of the previous proposals that you listed at the top there?
Not really. So everything, most of what we've done does overlap with RFC 7800, or maybe overlap isn't the right word, but does use RFC 7800 in some capacity to carry the sort of confirmation or proof key. But the actual OAuth level and protected resource access request and response protocol stuff is not there. There's not the same kind of overlap, if that makes sense.
Well, Brian, there is overlap with, like, conceptually, like, many of the solutions are very different, very similar. For example, if you take the Justin's HTTP signing, it's not that you do something entirely different. It's still HTTP signing. You missed out one thing that I relayed from the ACE working group when they worked on OSCORE. They also thought that would be a potential solution. But
so yeah, you're right.
The solution space is finite here.
There's a ton of conceptual similarity across a lot of these things, and you did put the OS core security in there, but I'm not sure that that's really the kind of solution anybody in the OAuth space is even interested in or looking at. Maybe others.
That's okay. That's fine.
And I mean, ultimately, yeah, it's all. This is a difficult issue because at some level it's really deceivingly simple. You have some key, you encode some indicator of that key into the token, and then when you use the token, you prove possession of that key. And at that level, they're all kind of like that, and they're all pretty similar. But there's issues that have come up, and we've run into a lot of different problems. And I think this long list of things is at least somewhat indicative of it not actually being that simple. So I guess trying to
for example, if you try to sort of like illustrate the differences. So for example, in the POP key distribution, that focused on symmetric and asymmetric keys, while you later remove the symmetric key part in DPOP. The token binding, of course, happened at a different layer, which made it different, of course. And the same is true for the mutual DLS, also operates at a different layer. I believe that's a big difference.
Right. What strikes me as interesting is actually the differences. So thanks for that list. That was actually really helpful. I mean, it seems to me that we've done a lot of different things in the space, largely in response to needs. And so when we made something, it was responsive to it. And we've done it a number of times to be responsive, and which is helpful. And then equally helpful is that we've gotten a lot of implementation experience of whether the solution that we thought would address the gap actually works. And it seems like we found various limits to those solutions. And kind of correct me here, it feels like we're circling back and saying, hey, listen, should we be maybe thinking about all that implementation experience, and is there a holistic solution that we could start thinking through, something more generic? And so if that's accurate, what strikes me is, do we have a really good handle on all of those limits that I would translate, instead of saying limits, saying all those requirements of the new thing we would want to generate? And if we were to have that, and we were to say we have this draft DPOP, what's interesting to me is what would not be done? What would not be solved with that?
One thing that was an issue, that sort of like the POP architecture was meant to collect use cases, requirements, threads, and so on. And one of the things, the symmetric key part was introduced there, and also later picked up by the ACE working group. And we had a discussion at some point in time on like, where would we do the parameter encoding for the HTTP transport, and where would we do the co-op stuff for this? And the decision back then was, after some back and forth with the two groups, was we do the HTTP stuff in OAuth and the co-op stuff in ACE. And now DPOP dropping the symmetric key, we suddenly left some strings hanging, essentially, for at least the ACE working group. I don't know if they changed their mind in the meanwhile, but at least that was not my reading of some of the documents recently.
I mean, just a little bit on that. The ACE working group was, till a while ago, was tracking a normative dependency on key distribution, but have since removed it and defined all the parameters they needed or wanted for their framework document in there.
No, with the normative requirement, or the normative dependency still exists. The issue was, we had a discussion, and I can look up the email where we found the agreement. You may remember we had this debate in the OAuth working group where, like, who is going to do the work, and then that was the consensus, and the encoding was actually removed from the document in ACE.
Okay, well, I've reviewed the ACE document because I had to do it for a JWT claims request, and I am personally not convinced that the encoding issue is solved. There's not a clean translation between the keys. I think Jim raised this after looking at it more closely. I'm not sure what the resolution is, but ultimately the ACE document does not normatively depend on POP key distribution anymore.
That is my understanding as well, is we are not normatively dependent upon any OAuth documents for that.
So right or wrong, it's not, that's not there.
So
And
how are then the use cases covered where you use HTTP to request a token and then use, for example, co-op over MQTT to pass it to the resource server.
I presume that's in the document if that's one of the use cases that the ACE working group was trying to solve. I believe they have parameters defined to pass the key, and presumably there's a relevant encoding from either a JSON or a CBOR implementation of that key or encoding of that key. And I'm not sure that actually works 100% of the time, but that's where it is.
Jim, is that correct?
The only big issue that I have run across is there are some. I did not care for the way that the CWT proof of possession token document did its registry work because it is confusing in terms of whether the CWT and the JWT are supposed to be the same thing and how the different key identifiers are encoded. But that's pretty easy to work around. And once we get some implementation experience, I think we'll just do an update to fix that.
I just reviewed the MQTT document in ACE, and I noticed that the functionality wasn't there. And I posted it a mail to the list, and they also said they thought that it's done in OAUTH.
Which functionality do you believe is not there?
Using HTTP to request the token that is then passed along with MQTT to the resource, which is their model.
Yes, I have that implemented on my machine.
But the question is, where is it in the spec?
At your request, the framework document is written to say you can use JSON and HTTP instead of co-op and CBOR.
Right. How do you get the keys for the Bob token from the authorization server? That's what the MQTT spec does.
I am posting over HTTP to my authorization server a ACE plus JSON message over HTTP. I can push the code up. I haven't done that because I'm not happy with it yet.
Okay.
Because I'm not using a real HTTP server.
Maybe you want to respond to the email because the authors didn't know how to.
Chidam Shangul here. I'm one of the co-authors of the MQTT TLS profile. I implemented it similarly to Jim said, but I knew that Hannes raised an issue before. It was acknowledged in the group, and that's what I acknowledged in the email, saying that I'm aware of the issue. I just the solution I was looking for was the text to say how to resolve the issue in the profile rather than an implementation issue.
I think you've assumed that Bob key distribution work would proceed.
It was one of I was looking at which described how it's done for the HTTP case, but then Jim pointed out that this has been resolved in the main document in his last email, and that's where I left things.
I guess we'll have to do some homework there again.
Yeah, I can't help feel like this is a little bit back to what I was saying initially. You know, we're trying to create a generic kind of solution here, which is great to help lots of different, well, we can call them use cases, lots of different requirements. But do we have a handle on it that if we had a candidate solution, Depop kind of or otherwise, that would scratch the itch of all the places we need. And if it did not, what's left to do? Because what I would like to avoid, if we're proceeding down a path of coming up with a generic solution, that we make what we perceive to be a generic solution, we're done, and as soon as we're done, we say, we actually didn't catch the following. If we can avoid it, that would be helpful.
It would be helpful, but I don't think we're necessarily looking for a generic solution so much as a deployable, workable solution for OAuth deployments in the relatively near term. Like that there are not dependent, but there are additional profiles and regulatory regimes and things that are demanding this stuff or placing requirements on this, and it would be really useful to have something that could be implemented and be interoperable and work.
Brian, in the original OAuth document 1.0, we had the Mac solution, and then the Mac solution was perceived to be difficult to implement, and that's why we then didn't go for that in OAuth 2. Justin was then working on a more generic version of the Mac, trying to address some of the challenges with the signing.
Yes, I'm aware. I just talked about that.
Right.
As well as
then,
the previous Mac solution. And
but
then,
I'm getting to that. But then you came up with an alternative, and Cabbage did so too, and Annabelle did as well.
I did not come up with an alternative to HTTP signing. I'm very, very much trying to do something that's not HTTP signing here. And I realize it's hard to distinguish between the two, but there is a distinguishing factor there.
Could I recommend that we let Brian actually finish a presentation for once? Because I see where he's going with this, and I think it would benefit the rest of the group to see that as well.
Thank you. Yeah, at least we would have that to discuss.
Right, because these are different things. I don't believe that Depop is being presented as a generic solution. I don't think that it is necessarily stepping on the web signature, the HTTP signature stuff that I'm working on with Annabelle and others. Nor is it really an answer to the Mac draft in quite the same way. So I propose we let Brian actually talk.
Thanks, Justin. And I guess before I do, I will try to address what Roman was saying, is in that I think the way you have framed things, Roman, is sensible and almost accurate. But in reality, there are a lot of disparate ideas and opinions and desires and use cases behind what is seemingly a simple case here. So it may not be as straightforward as you laid it out, as appealing as that might be. So circling back, trying to get through this, Depop was an idea. It's still an individual draft. It's an idea. It does depart from some things because the way that the keys are distributed or shared is fundamentally pretty different than what was described in key distribution. And sort of critically to that is part of the sharing of the keys includes some level of proof of ownership of the associated private key. And that itself enables things like the binding of a refresh token for public clients, which would not otherwise be possible and are not possible in the context of doing something along the lines of hop key distribution. It suffers from the potential problem, and we'll talk about this more, of being very inefficient due to the high use and the number of asymmetric cryptographic operations that are required. And Neil's suggestion on list was a way to do a lot of the same things, sort of get the more or less functional similarities in terms of how tokens are bound and used, but do it in a way that's not as inefficient. Although that's just an email at this point. We've had some other things come up that I didn't even know till I started looking at this and following the train of drafts, but we have what looks to be, from Annabelle, a rewriting of the work that Justin did, but split into 2 drafts, which I just saw, felt they should be here, but I'm not sure I understand the intent behind that.
I do understand the intent, and I can talk about that later if we have time.
Okay. And then relevant, but I do think sort of not directly related is the generalized work on HTTP message signing, which Justin and Annabelle have taken, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think I got it right, have more or less taken Cabbage and spruced it up a little bit and submitted it to the HTTP working group as a prospective sort of working group document going forward as a more general HTTP message level signature scheme. And I believe that was, it hasn't been done yet, but it is adopted by the working group as a work item going forward.
Yes.
I'm not sure whether it was.
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, I was going to say. I'm not sure whether it got adopted by the working group, but the sequencing of getting it done in HTTP is definitely was in flight when I last saw it.
I thought I'd seen the adoption.
Yeah, it has. Sorry to. This is Justin. Sorry to jump in, but yes, it has been adopted by the working group, and it is going to be an HTTP working group item. And that is, to be clear, where this sits with the rest of this work, that is just going to be on the scale of forming HTTP, forming signatures for HTTP messages and normalizing HTTP messages and whatnot. It does not account for the security properties of token presentation or what a token means, or even if you're representing a token with that presentation, or if you're just proving possession of a key as you make an HTTP request for some other reason. It is meant to be a very, very generic thing. So that actually brings back to Annabelle's other proposed drafts, where what you basically did was take the work that I had done previously, which was kind of a sort of a different swipe at what Cabbage had done with the other draft initially, and my work was bound tightly to OAuth. So what Annabelle basically did was say, okay, assume that we have a general purpose HTTP message signature. What are the parts that we actually need from the OAuth signing draft going forward? What do we need to be in the OAuth draft now that we could actually potentially depend on and use a general purpose HTTP signing mechanism, which we could not previously. That's Annabelle's 2 other drafts.
Whoa, okay, I did not read them that way, but that might be just a failing on my part.
She also has some what if drafts. So they're all named so similarly. I'm honestly not sure which drafts each of these are without going them up. But basically the 2 important ones are the one that's on the bottom, and whichever one says take that one that's on the bottom and put an OAuth token in it.
Okay,
those are the important parts.
That latter one I never found, or I read it wrong. But yeah, it's kind of.
Yeah, there have been a handful of other what if ones, which those may be, but they're less important. But yeah, you're right, they do exist. There's lots of ideas of how to do this out there. But again, sorry to jump in trying to
no, it's helpful.
Justin, you see how this happens, right?
Yeah, but I gave the floor back.
Me too.
All right, I'll take the floor. So while this was generally around POP in general, the interim, the impetus for a lot of this came out of the presentation and early criticism, or not early, heavy or vocal criticism of Depop. So I wanted to revisit that, at least try to understand them a little bit better. And so I tried to rephrase or paraphrase some of the criticisms of Depop that came out largely during the last meeting, but a little bit on the mail and comments here in the pre. And one of those is basically that it's not pop key distribution. That seems to be a running criticism. And yes, it's not. It's a little bit different. It accomplishes some different things, and is different. Concerningly, I think, is that an asymmetric cryptographic operation on every single HTTP request is just too expensive, at least for some. It's been said to me both publicly and in private that this would be a non-starter for at least some organizations or deployments. It just couldn't be done, just too expensive. And if you're not familiar with the details of DPoP, that's just an artifact of the way it works currently, the way it's written up. It requires a unique signature and signature verification over every signal request. And so that is potentially expensive. Tracking JTI, so there's a replay prevention mechanism that suggests or requires that JTI be tracked and rejected if duplicates are seen. And this makes some sense at a certain level, but it can be really prohibitive at scale. If you have to coordinate sort of whatever data structures tracking JTIs across a large distributed deployment, that can be really problematic. And if you combine that with at least one way to address the prior issue is the asymmetric crypto is expensive, yes, but it could scale out horizontally very well, at least in terms of overall performance and latency. It might still be expensive to run, but it would scale out horizontally well. But if you introduce the need to sort of track JTI across all instances of whatever you're running, that sort of undermines the ability to scale horizontally, and that can be really problematic. There is some language in there that I loosened up to try to allow for sort of a lazier or lighter weight approach of tracking JTI to the extent that it makes sense for the deployment, but it's arguably problematic. And I believe there was also the issue raised that it could also be sort of unexpected or to the point of violating sort of general HTTP retry semantics on I'm going to say it wrong, idempotent requests if different layers of the architecture see a JTI and prevent its replay when the actual processing of the message wasn't seen. So just generally JTI is problematic. And this is kind of not actionable, but I do want to note that it's a bit of a Rorschach test, even among the supporters of DPoP. I think different people have their different ideas of why it's useful and what the benefits bring for it. So even though there's there's criticisms as well as support of it, none of the support sort of rallies around the same thing. I don't think. It seems like everybody wants to see a little something different out of it or has a different idea of how it'll benefit them. Which makes, I guess, a generalized voice of support and why this is good a little bit difficult. I am personally a bit I've been on the fence about the asymmetric crypto cost. I mean, I recognize it's a fact of reality with asymmetric crypto and it's definitely more expensive, but I feel like I don't know if it's legitimately a non-starter for real deployments or not. It's real, but I don't know how real, I guess is a way of phrasing that. So trying to sort of get a look at where we are now and where we might want to go. This isn't necessarily all the options, but this is the best way I could kind of phrase it together. One thing we could do is we could stay the course of where we are now. And I'm not exactly sure what that looks like, but it sort of stands to be something between doing nothing, which is largely what we've been doing for a while, and maybe revving pop key distribution with some kind of HTTP signing mechanism. And the work that's happening in HTTP seems a lot more promising than having the OAuth level definitions of the same kind of stuff. But I don't know, that's maybe, but it's also early, so see where that goes, I suppose, or not. I don't know. That the stay the course and sort of do what we've been doing hasn't gotten us very far, but there are some developments that might provide some of the underlying tools there that would make that more tenable going forward at some point, although I don't think that's a very near point yet. I know there are some people, myself sort of on the fence, but some others too, that are at least somewhat interested in seeing the Depop work adopted, possibly tweaked, particularly around some of the JTI stuff, make it a little bit better, and see if we can get that out there as a solution for people that are wanting to do something about this today. A couple of quotes here I had from an email, I think off list, but you know, the performance characteristics of Depop are not ideal in some circumstances, but you know, for some of us mere mortals, it was said that Depop really is fine as is. It's functional and it can work, and that we have this need to have some kind of sender or key constrained refresh tokens issued to SPAs yesterday. At least for some, there's some real urgency here. They want to have a solution for this, and we don't have one right now at all. Binding refresh tokens, just there's nothing available at this point in any sort of standards track to make this happen. So I think arguably there's some value still, despite the efficiency problems, excuse me, in Depop, that we might want to consider taking on the work and moving it forward. But it also runs the risk of sort of complicating things by having multiple options. And we already have a lot of documents, a lot of options. And I think we do need to be conscientious of the way we message and the number of solutions we produce in this space. As I alluded to earlier, Neil on list suggested an approach that's somewhat similar to Depop in at least some of the conceptual levels, but using asymmetric keys, binding tokens to asymmetric keys, but using ECDH to sort of prove possession of those keys and then to amortize the cost of asymmetric crypto over many requests. Again, this would be riffing on Neil's idea. And this would allow for the derived or agreed upon key to be non-exportable. So it could be kept inside of either virtual or real sort of TPM-like things, or within sort of the non-exportable world of the browser web crypto API, and allow for unique keys to be negotiated between client and RS or client and AS that are used with an HMAC to show sort of bind to some amount of the HTTP request to prevent at least large scale or easy replay, show possession of that key, but do so in a way that they're only unique to those two parties. And we don't get back into the need to have additional sort of audiencing of tokens and so forth to prevent cross RS replay. There's work that would need to be done here, but after thinking about it quite a bit, I'm starting to feel like there's a lot of merit in this idea. And then, I don't know, do something and profit, which is just a nod to the old underwear gnomes piece from South Park, a little picture up there on the right.
So just quick question, Brian, just for me to understand the first bullet there. You're saying that if we go with the first bullet there, the proposal, then that will address your needs, and you don't need the second bullet, the Depop?
Oh no, it doesn't address my needs at all.
So these are two different things that you probably need anyway, right? Is that what you're saying?
I guess that's part of the problem. I don't know. I would like to see, I don't think the first one, it doesn't solve all the needs, and the immediacy of it, I don't think is where people want to see it.
I personally see bullet number one as throwing in the towel and just waiting to see what happens with HTTP signing. It doesn't solve anything immediately.
I tend to agree. I felt I don't know. I felt somewhat compelled to at least sort of note that is an option here. We don't have to do anything. But I agree with you. It does sort of feel like throwing in the towel and just giving up. And even if and when HTTP signing finds itself sort of fully realized and deployable, and I say that with a nod and hope towards Justin and Annabelle for good work there, and but recognizing that it's hard. It's really hard. But even if we get that done, then there would still need to be a layer of sort of profiling that over OAuth. And in the current world, that still doesn't give us anything for refresh tokens. So
So let me just again make sure I understand. So you're saying even if we HTTP signing will go and get approved tomorrow, we still have kind of gaps in that solution that will not address the DPoP needs. Is that what you're saying?
effectively, yes.
If we get the HTTP signing, is that still putting us in the same level of we need a signature operation on every message?
I believe those things are largely orthogonal because the HTTP signing is, well, I guess it depends on what comes out of it, but it's really a lot more about HTTP canonicalization than the actual signing itself. And I presume either way, it's going to allow for an asymmetric or a HMAC over whatever that canonicalized or hashed representation of the HTTP message is. The sort of asymmetric symmetric is really it's an orthogonal issue, I think, in how the keys are agreed upon and used between the two. And as I say that, there's likely some small intersection of signing over some bit of the HTTP message, regardless of which way you do it. But having HTTP signing done even yesterday doesn't solve the asymmetric versus symmetric crypto issue. It maybe gives some different tools for the syntax of what it looks like in presentation, but it doesn't address the core fundamental piece of it.
So if I can just make sure I understand what you mean by that. So for some, even if we do that option one, it may still be too expensive even if it happened today?
Maybe it depends on how it would be. That ends up being more of a deployment and algorithm choice question, I guess, based on my understanding of how these things work. But
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to mumble and say nothing worthwhile, so please.
Okay, so to give some perspective on the HTTP signing work, yes, we are starting with the cabbage draft, but we are by no means stopping there. There are some very, very big problems with the cabbage draft. It's very limited in sort of how it can manage keys in determining what is allowed to be signed and what is required to be signed and things like that. So to what I think may have been part of Jim's question, do you have to recalculate the signature over every request? Well, that kind of depends on what it is that you're signing as part of that request. And if you have a profile that says you must sign a nonce on every request and check that for replay, then yeah, that's going to change. If you are signing parts of the request that don't change over time, including perhaps the access token value itself, then yeah, that signature wouldn't change over time. The HTTP signing thing isn't really, it's not really going to be its job, at least this is my view as one of the editors. It's not really going to be that spec's job to dictate that type of requirement. That's more on the security layer of the application of the signing spec. What the signing spec is going to do is say, you have an HTTP message. Here's how you throw that into a signature or hashing function. And here's how you take the result of that and shove it back into an HTTP message so that you can send it. That's really all that ultimately that's what it's going to do. So Brian is absolutely right that even if we had a workable, fully functional HTTP signing thing today, which Cabbage is not for our purposes for some very specific reasons, but even if we did have that today, we would still need an OAuth profile of it that said, yes, you actually have to sign the access token. And by the way, this is how you send the access token so that it's tightly bound to the signature that you're sending. So yeah, there would still be work within this working group. I think there will be work within this working group, even in the light of the HTTP signing draft.
And maybe just to clarify a little bit too, what everything you say there is accurate, Justin. The way I was thinking about the asymmetric versus symmetric was really with the expectation that however this is done, almost certainly HTTP request is going to need a new signature over it. And that even if that wasn't the case, the complexity of trying to determine when a signature could be reused in some case that might be allowed is probably prohibitive enough to make it unlikely. So I was really down to believing that it's probably going to need to be done each time. And so the distinction in my mind around performance is really just using an asymmetric signature versus an HMAC, where asymmetric is, it's a couple of milliseconds, but to some that's prohibitively expensive, where calculating or verifying an HMAC is basically no op in our world these days. And I think can be considered performant enough that doing it every time doesn't matter at all.
Okay, that's I understand your interpretation now. Thank you for clarifying that.
But what you said is also true. We're just thinking about it in different ways.
Right, exactly. Because if you look at the Depop proofing mechanism, it only signs the method, the URI without parameters, and the token itself, right?
No, it
does not sign the token.
It does not sign the token. The token is bound to the associated key.
Right. So it's key presentation and token in here.
Yeah, but there's also a JTI in there and so at least the way it's written now means a new one every single time.
Right.
And that would be sort of expensive. I think doing the same kind of thing with an HMAC would be okay. It's so fast that I don't think it would be prohibitive to anybody.
Right, but because of the key distribution mechanism in Depop, that's a bad idea.
Yeah, well, it doesn't. Yeah, like it doesn't
work.
Doesn't work exactly.
Right, exactly. So yeah, for the HTTP signature thing, we are fully intending that to be both symmetric and asymmetric algorithms, because there are people that have been deploying Cabbage and Cabbage derivatives out there, of which there are at least a half dozen that I know about personally, which means there are a lot more. People are using it in both of those modes. So my view of this, of the Depop work and the HTTP signing work, is that they do seem to solve similar problems, but Depop really isn't as general purpose as it might seem at first, and I think that that's a feature. It was not my impression on first reading the draft, and I've told the authors this, that it's designed as, key presentation for single page apps. But if that's what it is, it does that really well. And it can probably be used with other apps too, if they want to, but ultimately I think we are going to have a general purpose proof of possession with a general purpose HTTP message signature, that I don't see a reason why that can't live in parallel to Depop. There's already more than one way to solve these problems, and it makes sense in different ways for different use cases, and different deployments is really the biggest thing.
I agree with you there, and I don't know what the number is, but at some point there are too many options.
I
I
get
don't know what that number is.
Yeah, I get that argument, but I think that that ship has sailed and come and set off again
Yeah.
in terms of OAuth.
Just my question from my side, Thorsten, what we have today?
Sorry, you broke up. Try again.
My question is to inform the decision or the discussion, how many deployable options do we have today? Because Justin and Brian were talking about options, too many options.
Deployable, we have one, and it's not deployable in a significant number of cases.
Okay, so even if we would push Depop forward and also have a solution based on the upcoming HTTP signing, it would be 3 options in total.
That's true. Well, but I guess because I've been thinking about it, I'm also considering the third bullet here as well. So potentially.
So in terms of actual implementations for key proof of possession, we have implementations of MTLS, we have implementations of Depop, and we have implementations of my old HTTP message signing that are still kicking around.
Fair.
So those are the 3 that I'm aware of. There are people that are doing Cabbage, but that are kind of tied to OAuth, but not in any interoperable way.
So question, can we take the and split up the symmetric versus asymmetric and the actual initial distribution of the key from the proof over the actual request of resources? So
that's the plan for the general. That was the plan for the general purpose OAuth POP. That's how it was structured, and that I think is the right method for the general purpose HTTP signing mechanism. Because how you get the key and how you use the key should be 2 different questions. Because I mean, if you look at, for example, how AWS does their key derivation for their signing stuff, like it's not a dynamic key distribution system. You do a derivation algorithm, and then you use the key that you have, like 4 steps into the process to actually call the API. The signing mechanism that you use for that should be the same whether or not you did this fancy Amazonian key derivation, or if somebody just said, hey, here's a JOC, use it.
I'm just wondering if a HTTP working from supplied message signature system and EPOP could eventually be reduced to, what sort of message are you signing on those requests?
So I think this is just my opinion as Justin. I think that if we had general purpose HTTP signing, then Depop could use that and still do its its optimized key distribution and proofing and presentation. But we don't have that, and it's going to be a long time before we do.
So this is Mike Jones. I wanted to add a few comments to some of the questions that have been raised. First, I wanted to respond to what is deployable. Microsoft is on record as having internally deployed the old OAuth HTTP signing for some internal proof of possessions for Office 365 and Azure. And the reason we did that is it's stable. It's stable by merit of being an abandoned draft and nobody's revising it, but it gives us something as a stopgap that we can deploy until there's consensus around something better. That said, our product groups would also like something that's simple like Depop. I realize that Depop is still in flux. But in particular, John and I and Brian talked during the last IETF about, okay, how could we add symmetric to Depop along the lines of what Neil had suggested. And there's a feasible path to do that. It is not quite as simple, but inherently you're having to do a key distribution step beforehand. I do agree with Justin that while the general HTTP signing is of long-term value, it would be great to get Depop into a stable state soon so that an industry which is dying for this could have it. This is not academic. People are stealing bearer tokens and using them to carry out attacks, and there's a number of mechanisms for that. And so I think we do have an onus to meet that market need sooner than later. So I would like to see the Depop draft adopted as a working group draft, recognizing that we may continue to revise it to add symmetric.
Oh, so you're saying you support adopting a Depop as is and later adding symmetric instead of initially or work on symmetric right now? Is that what we're saying?
I support adopting it as is to get it in the working group's attention. And then the working group can make a decision about whether to also add symmetric. We know how to do it.
Okay.
But I'd like to see the adoption happen so that we're signaling to the marketplace that we're addressing this issue rather than just waiting years.
This is Philip Skokan, OAUTH, and I share that sentiment. We'd also like to see adoption of the current state as is.
Yeah, I guess we will call for adoption on the mailing list anyway. But yeah, if people feel that they want to say that they support it, yeah, go ahead. Feel free to do that. Okay.
I wanted to ask a clarifying question about, so we've been talking a lot about what I would characterize as option one and not option one. Could we finesse a little bit about what I would say is option 2 and 3? How should we go about kind of reasoning about 3, given what we have written in 2?
Wait, what are 1, 2, and 3? I do not see those on the slide.
The first
Sorry,
purple
I'm logically just numbering them.
And I almost had numbers here. I apologize.
Yeah, I'm calling 1, stay the course, 2, push forward with the Depop kind of as is, and then 3 was we've had some kind of conversation from Neil's idea about doing something different, and 4, I'm not talking about that, really has kind of an option. So is there something we need to talk about 2 versus 3? Because 3 seems like a bunch more work than beyond what we've written down in 2, unless I'm misunderstanding it.
It's certainly more work to write down, and there's nothing in draft form written down beyond some ideas. It is something that could potentially be grafted on to 2, and so they are kind of one and the same, and you could somehow choose at runtime which to do. But I think that would be, having thought about it a little bit, I think that would be prohibitively difficult and super complicated. And so I guess 3 would be likely be its own thing that could live alongside and be deployed independently of, or even in conjunction with 2, if and when it got to that stage. Or we could, or it could just not be pursued, and we see if the need really arises or not. Or I guess some of my thinking was that the pushback on the performance of Depop 2 is so significant that it's not worth pursuing, and we should jump ahead to trying to build out 3 so it's more, it accomplishes a lot of the same things, but is a lot more performant and a little bit more complicated. That's sort of where I was trying to drive this, I guess, was either, to be honest, I'm a little uncertain, so I'm not sure, but adopting Depop is fine, moving forward with it doesn't preclude anything if 3, but I do think there's the risk of having too many options. I'm not sure that's the threshold or not. It may be just fine to do both. I'm sorry, did that answer it all, Roman?
Is the assessment that 3 that 2 is too slow or costs too much based on just theoretical assessment, or is it a practical experience?
I think it's.
I know that HMAC is faster than RSA and other asymmetric crypto algorithms. The question is whether this is really a problem.
I believe on the last meeting there was some strong language about asymmetric simply not being feasible for AWS compared to their current scheme. But as the slides say, for us mere mortals, Depop is fine as is, and I can confirm that with my deployments.
I think it depends upon the use case, which is efficient enough. There's plenty of things where the volume is low enough that asymmetric crypto is simple and fine. If you're running AWS, or maybe if you're running Azure, every cycle counts and you'll do the extra protocol steps to do that. But I think in terms of engaging the working group, the normal way to engage the working group is to adopt a working group document and then revise it. So that's what I'm proposing to do.
I fully agree with Mike on that point. I mean, let's move that forward. And if there is a need for having a more efficient scheme, people will step up and will contribute new algorithms, protocol extensions, and so on to make that happen. So to me, the whole conversation feels like a committee wanting to decide what the best solution will be for the market.
Phil Hunt here. I just had a question, somewhat orthogonal to the current discussion, but it may play in given the timeline to do this work. How does TLS 1.3 make some requirements moot or alter outcomes to this work? And I sort of say that in the light that Brian did a great job highlighting all the different efforts that have gone on, and I'm sort of concerned that we pile in again on Depop or some variation just to find out that it will have its own problems because of the other things that are changing around us, i.e. TLS 1.3, and if the HTTP working group is starting to do signing, is it premature? I'm just wondering about that.
I don't think there's anything there. Depop is moving away from the reliance on any kind of key or exported key or identifier from the transport layer.
Mm-hmm.
And so it could be deployed over 1.3 just the same as it would over 1.2. And it's kind of a no-op. There were some potential problems with the exported key material in token binding because it wanted to play across those layers. But in this particular, like where we're trying to work on the application layer around Depop is sort of completely independent of that. So I don't think there's an intersection or overlap there.
Okay. Thanks.
And as far as the HTTP thing, I will just reiterate that as one of the authors or editors of that spec as it moves into the HTTP working group, I do think that there's room for both. I do not think that Depop should be stretched and twisted to be a general solution. I don't think it is. I think it, and Brian, I mean this in the best way possible. I think that it is a really clever hack for a really specific set of deployments and use cases.
I wouldn't have used the word hack, but I otherwise agree with you.
Right. Yeah, I figured that's where the contention would be. But
what concerns me is the tendency by the market to try and always find to take one solution, whether it's appropriate or not, and apply it everywhere. And then they get upset.
Why we need more than one solution, Phil. This is exactly why we need to do multiple things instead of trying to pretend that we're going to come up with one thing and apply it everywhere. That's why I think we should do Depop. It's pretty well defined. It's implemented. A a number of times. I think it could use a little bit of cleanup for the most part. I think it makes a lot of sense as it stands today. If there's a clever way to layer in symmetric stuff on there without exploding everything, I think that makes some sense. But I honestly think that things like AWS shouldn't use it. I mean, you know, sending the entire key or something like that every time doesn't make sense at the scale of AWS anyway. You know, there's a whole provisioning thing that is outside the model of Depop, which is about these, you know, limited deployment. You know, there's a copy of an app that has one key that you may or may not have seen before, and then you just need to protect the tokens for that. You know, AWS should be using the HTTP in an ideal world, the eventual HTTP signing from the working group, which is of course based largely in part on AWS signatures in its history, and layering in the OAuth access token binding that I hope this working group to adopt at some point in the future when the time comes. I mean, I don't see these as competing with each other so much as they are complementing different bits. Now, are there going to be a number of places that will deploy Depop, and then when this other stuff comes around, they turn around and say, oh, that actually fits better? Yeah, probably. But I mean, the same argument with the stuff we're doing at TXOff as well.
If it's that we need to make clear, and I like the point that Brian made again, was that the issue of proof of possession is orthogonal to message signing. And maybe that's the track, is to say, number one, those two things are always going to be separate going forward, and that way they're clear and have a greater chance. And then within those forks, those two orthogonal approaches, to your point, Justin, there may be need for specialization because it is difficult to do general purpose. I'm just a little worried that we're repeating a cycle again for the third or fourth time in 10 years. So we have to keep working on it. I'm just not sure that we're working on the right thing yet.
So this is Mike Jones again. I will point out that the slides left off, maybe mercifully, one piece of the POP history in the OAuth working group, which is we created something called OAuth 1, which used proof of possession tokens. And the marketplace largely abandoned it because of the interoperability problems encountered when trying to actually do the HTTP signing in the way specified.
When I was looking at MTLS, and I was quite excited by it, one of the problems I ran into was a similar perception of, do we really need it? Mike, you spoke to that there are threats with bearer tokens, but I think there's two extremes right now: to sign everything and encrypt everything and throw crypto at every layer and do everything and go nuts. But none of those actually work. And then the other people are saying, but this stuff's working. Why are we complicating things unnecessarily? And so it's frustrating to me to say, what's the right level? I guess that's why I like the idea. If we say, okay, if we solve token binding, and that's all we solve, that's a big improvement. And then maybe it's appropriate that the apps, which is more of a niche area like financial APIs, look to their own solution in that niche because they can specialize it appropriately.
Part of why, reflecting on my OAuth 1 semi-throwaway comment, is part of why I like Depop is, just like bearer tokens, it does very little. It does just enough more to actually get proof of possession. And, as Justin described the glorious hack, or whatever you want to characterize it as, it signs just as little as possible to be able to demonstrate proof of possession for the tokens, thereby solving a marketplace need.
Yeah, I like that.
As Justin and some others have said too, there's definitely some opportunity available in the text of the draft to make some of those things more clear. And I don't think it's as simple as saying this is for only SPA type apps. I do think there's a lot that could benefit from clarifying sort of what it is and isn't and what it can do. I've certainly signed up to work on that text going forward if we proceed with this.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a very good discussion, guys. Anybody else has any other comments that they want to chime in? Separate, the different from what we heard so far. Okay. Okay. Like I've heard lots of support for Depop, but we're not going to be able to call kind of a hum or something for this. We will have to take it into the mailing list to give everyone an opportunity to chime in. So, but I think it was a really good discussion, and I guess that's where I think next step is just to take it to the list and see if people are interested in adopting this, and whether it's asymmetric and symmetric is a different story. The work group will have to decide later on the scope of that. But I think the goal, the action right now, for me at least, as chairs, to ask for adoption on the mailing list and see how that goes. Is that fair? Anybody has make sense?
Ripad, at the beginning of the meeting, Jim asked on sort of how many folks on the call are going to be at the face-to-face meeting.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, I just wanted to finish the first one. Anybody has any comments about the next step for the Depop discussion?
So Rifa, just to so if I can confirm it. So what's going to happen is on the mailing list, there'll be a call for adoption. It will not be framed as the different options the way we've been talking, which has been very informative, but we're going to be just very precise. We have a draft. Are we adopting or not adopting the draft, right?
Correct. That's exactly what.
Perfect.
The plan. Okay.
Just checking.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Okay. Anybody has any other comment about this before I ask who is going to be in Vancouver? Okay. So regarding Vancouver, unfortunately, neither I nor Hannes will be there, and we wanted to know who's planning on attending the meeting in Vancouver to understand if we can have a meaningful meeting. So who's attending in person?
I plan to.
I plan to. If again, happen.
I'm also planning to. Aaron here.
This is Mike. I plan to.
This is David. I also plan to.
David.
This from Spencer. I'm planning to if others are going to be there.
Tony, I'm planning to.
Who was the last one? Sorry. Tony. Anybody else?
This is Matt. I'll also be attending, but it depends a lot on if other people are attending, which seems a lot of people are having the same thought. I wonder if there's a more formal way to make sure that everybody's going to actually confirm that.
Bit of game theory, isn't it?
Okay. You know what? Maybe we can put some. Go ahead.
For what it's worth, I plan to go unless the entire meeting is canceled.
Yeah,
formally by the IETF.
Yeah, same.
That's still, I think, under consideration there. It might. I don't know.
This is a challenge.
Taking no formal position. The IESG is actively considering all three constraints as Jay has been putting on the IETF list. period, no further comment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Okay, that's all, I think. Anybody else have any other comments or something that they want to discuss? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead, Brian. You wanna?
I was just going to say thank you to you and
Yeah.
Hannes and the ADs for putting this together.
Okay. No, thank you guys, and appreciate your help. And that was a great discussion. So thank you for that. And we'll take it to the list to continue this discussion. Okay.
That's good. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Good evening, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.